This is Gender in Focus. I'm Elle, and each week I sit down with the president of Transfocus Consulting and all-round gender diversity genius, Kai Scott. I get to ask all the questions you've ever wanted to ask about how to make the workplace and the world a better place for trans and non-binary people. Let's get into it.
In today's episode, we are exploring the wonderful world of washrooms again. In a previous episode, we looked closely at the design of these spaces with Marnie Robinson from HCMA. We'll add a link to the show notes in case you want to check that out. But in today's episode, we're taking a closer look at the social dynamics in washrooms and change rooms. There's a lot going on in these spaces, especially men's and women's facilities, with lots of strong opinions of who should belong where and what we should do. We unpack these issues in a thoughtful and practical way to hopefully provide greater insights and ideas for how we can be with each other in an inclusive and a safe way. And I'm really excited to talk about this very important topic. It's very timely with my co-podder, Elle. How's it going?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah.
This is a topic that we see everywhere at the moment, and there was a lot of interest in Marnie's episode, so unsurprisingly. So I'm pretty interested to see how this is going to go. It's pretty timely, as you said. There's a lot of stuff in the news right now about washroom access. So I wanted to ask, first of all, what issues trans and non-binary people face when it comes to washrooms?
Yeah, certainly within washroom and change room spaces, there's all variety of challenges, right? In terms of being able to access the washroom, depending on how the trans or non-binary person looks and whether they kind of align with how society expects they look for their gender. They can have more or less challenges. And this is very similar to people who are not trans. So this is not exclusive to trans folks, but certainly more often than not, trans and non-binary folks do face challenges. Depends on where they're going and what's happening. But certainly men's and women's spaces in particular, whether washrooms or change rooms, we do find quite a lot of trans and non-binary folks face challenges. So much so that they tend to avoid those spaces just because it's so hard. So what happens is, somebody goes into a washroom intending to go to the toilet, and people can face any number of things from kind of pretty subtle, maybe stares, occasionally a little bit more kind of in the middle of the spectrum of like comments. Sometimes people do that double take that somebody comes into the washroom and then people are like, did I come into the right place? And they'll look at the signage. People will say things, they'll ask questions. The men's room is somewhere else, right? As a way to indicate in their mind that person is not in the right place. And it can get as bad as, even if it's not as common, harassment, people telling and yelling, being rude, hostile. They can even involve staff, calling on staff to intervene, and somebody that they think is in the wrong washroom, and any number of other things. Like there's just so many stories out there now, sadly, where people are encountering these challenges. But it all boils down to they just don't look how people expect them to, right? So if somebody is somebody looks a little bit more masculine, whether cisgender or transgender, into the women's washroom, there are now, a lot of pushback to that access. It doesn't happen as much, but there are still eyebrows raised when a more feminine looking person goes into the men's washroom or change room. So that's just a bit of an overview of some of those challenges.
You mentioned a little bit earlier then about how this is actually wider than just an issue for trans people. Can you go into that a little bit? Because I think that might surprise some people.
Right. It's just not on people's radars. Most people, or a lot of people, look how we expect so a lot of women present in feminine ways and a lot of men look masculine. So their gender identity aligns or matches some way or aligns with their gender expression. There's kind of two categories of things, and in society we expect those to be aligned. But for a lot of cisgender folks, as well as trans, although a little bit more disproportionately impacts trans and non-binary folks. Their gender does not align with their gender expression. And so, if it will give you an example, somebody accessing the women's facility, maybe has a tie on, maybe is a bit taller, all these different features that we've kind of coded one way or another are at play, we come in all kinds of shapes, sizes, diversity of how we look. So, of course, there would be some that would be a bit more masculine looking. This can be not just in what the clothing people wear, but it can also be the shape of their body as well,
Mm-hmm.
right? So maybe a little bit more flat chested. And again, both cis and trans women could look in this way, right? Facial hair is another one as well. And this is where there's perhaps an intersectional piece to the puzzle where, women of color can have a bit more facial hair. And so it's not just trans women that have facial hair. There are also cisgender women that have facial hair in a way that is noticeable to others, that they code in a particular way or identify them as, men. And so it's just really tricky when you're only focused on somebody's appearance as a way to determine if somebody is, quote, in the right place. You might not be getting it correct 100% of the time. And that presents unique challenges to those folks who are perhaps at the margins of societal expectations.
Mm-hmm. You have talked about the things that trans and non-binary people face when they don't fit certain standards and they go into washrooms. And I would imagine that for a lot of people, that's a really heavy burden to have to carry and to think about every day. What are the measures that trans people generally take? I would imagine avoidance is a pretty big one.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so avoidance would be probably the top strategy. We know from a survey of 27,000 trans people in the United States, kind of a good proxy for what's happening in Canada. I think we have comparable data with Trans Pulse Canada of 3,000 trans folks in Canada that have said similar things, but the US data is 59% of folks avoid washrooms in a public setting. They wait until they get home, which is no small feat, right? If you're out and about and you have to go, that's really hard to be able to hold to when you get home. So that tells you just how dire it is that somebody is willing to have that level of discomfort to be able to get a safe place to go relieve themselves. Additional strategies to be able to avoid is that about a third of trans and non-binary folks in this survey of 27,000 trans folks avoid drink and food. So basically nothing going through their system during the day to be able to make it to home, to be able to relieve themselves. So but of course that avoidance isn't cost free. There's not just the discomfort piece, but there's actually much higher levels of urinary tract infections among trans folks because they're holding and wanting to get home. So there's just so many layers to this. There's no way to address this really in a way that isn't cost free. So you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And it's an impossible place for a lot of trans and non-binary folks. And so that's why there's such a keen interest in, single unit washrooms for any gender or all gender multi-stool washrooms where these social dynamics aren't at play. Pretty much just anyone can go, no questions asked, no side eye, no stares, comments, harassment, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
It's a pretty great solution then.
Right.
Can I ask you about the sort of non-binary experience when it comes to only being faced with men's and women's washrooms and what you've seen with Transfocus when it comes to that?
Yeah, that's such an unfortunate situation. I think most people don't realize the impossible position that puts non-binary folks in. A lot of folks don't know that non-binary people exist, and they're neither men nor women, or not exclusively. And so just saying, well, pick one of the two, right,
Hmm.
is not actually a solution. Like, yes, it's one way to address it in the moment, but it's not a long-term solution. We shouldn't force people into places that don't align with their gender identity. Uh, Particularly because of the social dynamics that I was talking about, it
Right.
really does put non-binary folks in a precarious, or some of them at least, in a very precarious position of being, stared, yelled at, whatever list of things.
Hmm.
And it's, yeah, just not a place for them. That's not where they would go. Certainly, we don't want to force people in those instances to not use the facility. If if those are the only two available, those one over
Hmm.
the other needs to be provided. But it's not great for
Right.
non-binary folks. And so we need to come up with other options. And of course, it's not just because of non-binary folks. There's a whole host of different reasons why these types of facilities don't meet everybody's needs, right? And so that's where, these, it's kind of thinking beyond, binary only is really key and
Hmm.
often overlooked, or people just don't realize this is an issue. They
Right.
just think, oh well, they'll just pick one of them and then we're fine. And it's like, no, 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 this is not the way forward. And so to have people think beyond that, or even to be aware, if you're staff in that organization, to be aware of other options, maybe not in that building or on that floor, but perhaps another floor has another option, right? A single unit. So just being aware of what's around you, or maybe there's a nearby Starbucks, right?
Hmm.
Just that even little bit of extra effort can really help non-binary folks who are in a total pickle, in a bind, when there's men's and women's, which unfortunately is a lot of places in our
Hmm.
society. We've only thought of men and women, boys and girls, and we have not thought of non-binary folks. And so it's just this big missing gap. And of course, it shows up in other areas besides washrooms. But washrooms, because it's such a daily need,
Hmm.
it's just like such a reinforced reminder for non-binary folks that they don't belong, like
For
just
sure.
not counted or accounted for, and don't belong. And what a message to send somebody who is either an employee or a client,
Hmm.
or who, any number of relationships to the organization. So it's a huge miss, one that sometimes people discount, right, for a variety of
Sure.
reasons. So, but I
Hmm.
don't think that should be the case.
One of the things I've noticed since moving to Canada is that that isn't such an issue in Europe.
Hmm.
Well, at least from my experience, not to speak for the whole of Europe, but there tends to be a bit more options when it comes to washrooms. That it's not as often split into men's and women's, and I think there is this kind of idea that it's like an impossible task, and it's just not doable, and there is no solution. But there
Hmm.
are other places that do this quite successfully, uh,
Absolutely.
which I
Yeah.
find really interesting.
Oh yeah. I grew up in Germany, and so,
Hmm.
you know, part of me is learning and trying to understand the different types of needs. And I think it is
Hmm.
important to account for them in a North American context. But for
Hmm.
me personally, I grew up in a setting where, there's a lot of shared space,
Hmm.
in levels of undress, right? Like
Hmm.
with everybody,
Yeah. Sure.
old,
Yeah.
young, men, women, non binary folks, like everybody's chilling, and it's an NBD moment. It's a no big
Hmm.
deal, right?
Right. Yeah.
I was even take German lessons, and I was talking to my teacher, and she was reminding me about the saunas. You are not allowed to wear clothing in the
Yeah.
German sauna, right?
Mhm.
So it's just
It's the
like,
same in a lot of places in
yeah,
Europe. Yeah.
right. And so it's just like it's part of the culture for it not to be yeah, there's many layers to it.
Hmm.
In North America, particularly, bodies are heavily sexualized, right,
Yeah.
in ways that they just aren't in Europe. Not to say that that doesn't happen. Of course, it
Hmm.
does, but it's much more normalized for people to be in certain settings, not everywhere, to be in levels of undress with each other in a way
Hmm.
that, and there's just an appreciation for different types of bodies too, right? Like it's just not, there's not one very narrow cookie cutter body that everybody's supposed to line up against.
Hmm.
And so there's space for body hair, and there's space for, different sizes. And it's just you just wouldn't have as much commentary as a lot of trans and non-binary, as well as some cisgender folk face in accessing facilities. People just wouldn't bat an eye. It's like,
Hmm.
yeah, but I mean, that's just a part of normal human diversity. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. On that note about saunas, I wanted to go to changing rooms, because that does bring another level, another dynamic of, it's not just as simple as going to the washroom and then leaving.
Oh, yeah. This is understandably one level up from washrooms. There's still
Yeah.
quite a bit of sensitivity or related to washrooms, especially in a more North American context. When you go to change rooms, especially if there's kind of shared areas of either changing or showering, where this becomes even more sensitive, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I understand it. People want to be safe and comfortable in a change room setting, and uh, it depends. Like, I will say there is a difference, typically, of course, not every place, but between men's and women's facility on this count. So there tends to be a bit more privacy built into the women's side of things. So either private showers and or private change booths. And I think that adds a level of comfort and to the experience, so people can kind of have their own space and be with their own bodies, right? And not have
Hmm.
to see other bodies and whatnot. Now, if it's an older facility, it tends to be a bit more everybody's out in the open doing their thing, right? Um,
Yeah.
and in that case, people can see different types of bodies. Uh, I will say, for the most part, generally, trans and non-binary, myself included, tend to try to create privacy if there isn't privacy, right? So using a towel and, face towards a corner, there's all these different strategies. Sometimes you can orient the lockers so that they kind of cover those kinds of things. But that isn't always possible, may not always be the case, or some people, it's just not their way of doing it, right? They're just going to
Hmm.
casually dress as they always do. And so some people will see people in undress the bodies that they didn't expect in those spaces. And that can create quite a bit of disruption where, people become alarmed. I would say specifically within women's change
Yeah.
rooms, this is a big issue. One that a lot of municipalities, especially in pools or fitness centers, they're really wrestling with and trying to find a way through. And so, yeah, I can appreciate that. There's a lot there to sort out. And certainly, as trans and non-binary folks, this is pretty difficult. I think it's difficult for many people, including cis people. I mean, not everybody wants to undress with strangers, right? This is not like a hit, you know? And so that's where I think there's a lot more that can be done to help everybody in that space, right?
Hmm.
To be able to access it, to be able to comfortably navigate, and to be able to get to whatever they're doing, swim laps, bench press, whatever the case, fitness class, yoga, whatnot. So I think, we can talk about those, but those are some of the issues at play in change rooms, and why it really kind of hits at a huge, or it comes to a head quite a bit.
Hmm. Can you talk about, you mentioned that there's the difference between men's and women's changing rooms. You told me some stuff about it that truly horrified
Yeah,
me.
yeah, yeah.
So can you go into that, because that really affects everyone who enters that space rather than just trans people. That sounds
Oh,
pretty
yeah.
horrendous.
Yes. So there is that difference between men's and women's facility, as I was mentioning. And especially when it comes to men's facilities, although it does occasionally happen, although less for women's, is the open concept shower, right? So you have, I don't know, 3, 4 plus shower heads, and everybody's in the thing together. I mean, it's like the cliche sports situation, right? And I've read a bit of the history of why that is. Some of it is related to like military history, but the concept that men just ought to be comfortable and just to be with each other
Mm.
in that way, when it's actually not the case. We've done quite a bit of research, and a lot of cisgender men do not like that setup. Like, it's
Sure.
not a,
Understandably.
and that exposes folks to cisgender men or boys as well, to a level of harassment and hazing in a sports context, for anybody that looks even just an iota different from, quote, the standard, right?
Hmm.
And there's also sexual harassment as well, right? So it's just,
Yeah.
it goes really deep and pretty dark. And certainly trans and non-binary folks face that as well, right? So
Hmm.
myself as a trans man, navigating open concept is pretty terrifying, right?
Hmm.
um, and so there are all kinds of decisions that I make. If I'm with a team, I may be more inclined to use that space, knowing I have people there in case things go off the rail, which they can and have,
Hmm.
for me. And so this is where there's a lot of complex decision making. Obviously, I'd love to just show up and be able to waltz through and then carry on, right?
Hmm.
But that's just not always available. And then I know others, we've done tons of research, especially in a recreation space, where that's just a no-go for
Hmm.
trans not like non-binary folks, as well as trans men. It's just like, no, I won't even go there. Maybe I'll arrive changed and then just walk home and shower at home, right? So people can make the decisions, but if it's not working for cis men and it's not working for trans men, why is this still the case, right? And so
Right.
that's where it's like, okay, trans men might have the more pressing need, but there's like a whole
Hmm.
other cohort of cis men behind us being like, yeah, please make this change. And
Right.
so just more privacy is just not universal, but near universal request, whether, no matter which gender, it's clearly people want to be able to have their own space.
Hmm.
And if we were able to change the culture, maybe that wouldn't be needed as much. If we were able to kind of take down a few of the notches of those expectations, maybe it would be easier. But for now, I think, unfortunately, we're headed in a different direction, and where privacy is a greater need.
Hmm. That must be so heavy to carry for a lot of people, because it seems like it's such a, like, from the outside it maybe seems like such a small thing, but
Mm.
that's like meaning that people won't use the facilities because
Yeah.
they don't feel safe just getting changed.
Yeah. And sometimes, organizations will point to, well, we've got washrooms, right? So that's kind of like this quasi change space, or can function as that. And sure, but it's
Yeah.
it's a very small space, for one, and two, if you think about people with disabilities, or just needing more space, maybe they have kids in tow. It's just like,
Mm.
you add variables to it, and suddenly it's not feasible. It's not feasible for just pretty much anyone, but even more so for others. So I think if people just kind of thought it through a little bit more, they realize, oh, we need a kind of a structural change, or, as I was saying, a cultural change.
Hmm.
So we can change this culturally. We don't have to or we may not even need a structural change, if we're able to have a little bit more, grace and capacity to just understand people come in all shapes and sizes.
Hmm.
So, I mean, that's maybe a bit further of a stretch. Culture change is quite difficult, but yeah.
And takes a long time.
Yes, yes. There are these situations where trans people are asked to be more modest, than is expected or asked of cisgender people in change rooms. This is coming out of a nervousness, not knowing how to address a particular situation among staff of that facility, and so they just kind of go to, let's do something with the trans person, and then everything will be settled, right?
Mm.
So it's this kind of forced modesty that happens, for trans folks. And some trans people are very comfortable, and they like their bodies, and they're okay with them. And not in the way that society is, but certainly they're okay. And we don't ever want to, hopefully, mess with that, right? Like,
Mhm.
I think anybody being proud of their body is like a triumph in our society, right? So,
100%. Yes,
like, let's keep it that way. Now,
please.
I will say, if there is a like, I think every organization needs to make their own decisions, but there's a few options available, right? Either
Mhm.
everybody is allowed to be levels of undress in a shared space within a women's or men's facility,
Mhm.
or nobody, right? So that's
Right.
the second option. That's the one that most organizations don't even know is available to them. So
Mhm.
if you are going to go for modesty, that's everyone, right? So you can have signs that say we expect at the very least, everybody has like it covers their genitals, or whatever you want to call it, the nether regions. But that's the minimum attire in that space, and that's actually a way of creating privacy, even if the facilities are not up to speed for providing change booths or private shower spaces. So you can introduce that to say, hey, everybody's got to do it, and
Mhm.
and then that actually helps with some of the surprise that people experience when they see a trans person. But if you're only focused on the trans person, that's problematic.
For sure.
So you want to like think it through. For some, it'll be everybody gets to be, you know,
Mhm.
free to be in any form of undress, or maybe they decide minimum attire is a way to handle all of this. And I think more and more people are starting to shift to that minimum attire, because there's so many factors. It's not just trans and non-binary issues, where it's just a lot easier to navigate when you have everybody having some sort of minimum attire.
Mhm. So, the big question on everybody's minds when it comes to this is safety.
Mm.
Mainly, it seems to be safety concerns for cisgender women and
Mhm.
girls. Could you go into that a bit, please?
Yes,
Please help
absolutely.
us. Help us understand this.
No worries. And we've been at this for a few years, so we have a few insights. Uh, So, safety. It's really important. And I will say everyone deserves safety, full stop, right?
Mhm.
If you show up to a facility, you should expect to be able to navigate it safely. That means free of harassment, free of all kinds of inappropriate behavior. Um, I will acknowledge that people have had trauma in washrooms and change rooms, right?
Mhm.
That goes on. We talked about the men's side, but it also the women's side, right? Non-binary folks as well, right? So it's just like there is trauma in this space. And I think it's really important to honor that trauma, that people could be responding from trauma, right? So having had that, or in like confined spaces, maybe it's not specifically a washroom or change room, but that space reminds them of that, right?
Mhm.
Kind of being
Yeah.
trapped, right? So I always want to start with that. And I will say that some people express concern of like, how do we know who belongs where to be able to determine safety? And so this kind of focus on, you know, how somebody looks to be able to determine if they're in the right place, or some sort of criteria. People want something to be like, we're kind of tagging people, belong, don't belong, and whatnot.
Mhm.
So I understand that desire for figuring out how to determine safety, but I wonder if it's not going to give people the answers they need, right? So just because somebody looks feminine and they're headed into the women's washroom tells you zero about whether they're going to be safe or not, right?
Mhm.
They may actually be harmful. you know um, I think sometimes we go too quickly to be like, women and or feminine appearing people are going to be safe, right?
Mhm.
That's not actually what the data tells us. So, and that's surprising to us, because we have a
For sure.
concept, right, of like 100% innocence, and that's just not the case. And it's not to discount the harm that women and femme appearing folks have had, right? Of course, that has been real, awful trauma. So it's just balancing all these different factors. And so that's where we've landed in a slightly different place about safety. Safety is at the core. How do we determine that? We're looking at behavior. So no matter who someone is, if they are acting in inappropriate ways, that's not acceptable to the space, right? And we know what those are, or they've been written down in a policy by the org, right? Staring, lurking, taking photography, inappropriate touching, we've got a list already. We have pretty clear concept. Maybe it warrants, if you haven't written it down as an org, to write it down so it's really spelled out. So there's no mystery and it's easier for staff to enforce, but that's the measure. And then it's really easy to report it, to be like, hey, I was in the change room and this person took a photo of me. Like, boom, staff in there right there. They know what to deal with. And then it's not about, there was somebody who looked like a man in the washroom, right? Like, what does that tell you about? And,
Yeah.
and then when you prompt a little bit further, more often than not, that person was just going into the stall, relieving themselves, coming out, maybe, hopefully, washing their hands, and then exiting, right? Like, that's an appropriate use of the washroom, right? So I think people get a bit stuck just knowing what the basis of safety is and recognizing that, right now and certainly in the past, it was looks based, but that may not give us the full story. And what's a solid basis is behavior.
It's such a simple reframe, but it's quite hard to grasp.
Yeah.
For a lot of people.
Yeah.
And we have a resource about this, the Rethinking Safety in Washrooms resource, that I can link in the show notes. But that goes into all of that, right? The kind of levels that you've been talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just helps with some of the reframe, because it's maybe a bit of a jump to go just from looks, because looks, hey, that's simple, right? It's super easy. It's really apparent. Okay. Whoa, that person looks different. Immediately registers, right? And so it feels like a really tangible, actionable item, right? This person looks not how I expected. And then off we go. Versus behavior, there's a bit more that you need to pay attention to. And maybe it's not readily apparent, right, for somebody. In some instances it is, right? Like harassment is very clear, right?
Sure.
If somebody is coming at you very aggressively or whatnot. So, and so that's really important. But I think that reframe is key, because unfortunately, some of the dynamics, what can happen, especially in women's spaces, is that the fear of safety can then produce additional harm. And it's unintended. I don't think many cis women intend to create harm, but they kind of just are so fully wrapped up in the fear of something going wrong that they can't see that nothing is going on. And then that person, whoever they're upset at, or talk to staff about, and then the staff talk to them, they're now in having to carry that fear that person put out, rather than just taking a beat to see what's going on in this lens of behavior, can avoid some of that dynamic. And then that person doesn't then feel like, because it's not just one time that happens to, they're getting that a lot, right? So just not contributing to that dynamic. Yeah.
What does the law say about this?
Yes. So the law in Canada, also, I'm not a lawyer, but it's this non-legal.
I asked that very bluntly then, as if you would know all the details immediately. Tell me, please.
Yes. My legal training, no. Yeah, so, but of course, I am a nerd, big time nerd. So I do read all the court cases, because I'm very fascinated by the law and how it tries to clarify things. And but certainly, we've had about a dozen court cases since the 1990s. Actually, I think 1980s. So we almost have 40 years of case law in Canada that have clarified that anyone, trans, cisgender, can use the facility that aligns with their gender identity. And that is so key, because for trans people, there is a difference between their gender identity and what they were assigned at birth in terms of their sex. what people thought they were, their gender was, but wasn't. And so the being able to access the facilities based on gender, an example for me, I'm a man, I'm going to the men's washroom or the change room, right? That's where
Mm-hmm.
I belong, and end of story. Perfect. If it was based on sex, which say Utah, Florida, Texas, there's like, I think almost 20 states now that have a washroom access based on sex at birth. So in those instances, although I wouldn't do it, I I mean, also, I want to note I do have privilege in this case, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I do look like how people expect men to look, right? Maybe when I'm wearing this like floral shirt that I've got today, maybe it's a little like question mark. No, but like I have short hair. I have some facial hair. I have a flat chest. I'm tall. I'm 5'10". That's kind of the men's average. So if I were to go into a washroom in say Utah, I don't think people would know that I am
Mm-hmm.
trans in a way that they would confront me or tell on me or call the police or whatever repercussions they
Mm-hmm.
take. This is primarily an issue that people who don't look how society expects are facing. So I want to
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge that piece, that it can be easier for me to, um, use the washroom that aligns for me, even
Mm-hmm.
when the law is against it, right? In ways that
Mm-hmm.
I will likely not get in trouble for.
Right.
Um, Now, the states in the United States that say it's based on sex, they're actually not solving the problem at all,
Mm-hmm.
because unfortunately, that just puts trans and non-binary folks in a tough position where some of them will actually go into, say, trans men will go into women's facilities, and trans women will go into men's facilities. Now, the women will still have people that they didn't expect going into their
Right.
facilities. So it's just like, and this guys, there really are men coming into the women's facilities in that case, so it's just like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think most people have thought it through,
No.
and to try to solve it on a practical basis, in the ways that we're suggesting or offering. But the law in Canada is very clear. It's settled,
Mm-hmm.
and most people don't know about that, and they are quite surprised that we have determined it based on gender identity. But it's helpful sometimes for them to be like, okay, I see that's how we've done it. The sky hasn't fallen over the 40 years in Canada.
Right.
We're
Yeah.
still here. Maybe, I don't know. We'll see. No, we trust in our leadership to be able to defend our honor. um, and so, yeah. So I think that's an encouraging note to see that this is possible, uh, in a way that honors trans and non-binary folks.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any final thoughts on this before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think surprisingly, washrooms and change rooms are this flashpoint that allows
Mm-hmm.
us to better understand human nature, our societal expectations, whether we're okay with those as a society. We get to make a choice. And certainly, trans and non binary folks are kind of at the tip of this, and create that need for change. But of course, it's not just trans and non-binary folks. And I think this is a discussion, and usually an iterative discussion that needs to happen, that has been needing to be happening for a while now, and for us to be able to envision how we can better be with each other. So we're inclusive, we're safe, we can have both of those. I think sometimes people think those are intention somehow, and I don't think that's
Mm-hmm.
the case. We do need to adjust things culturally for that to be possible, or create other structures to help us be able to do that, including increasing privacy. But I hope to inspire people to really lean into the cultural, and that might mean moments of discomfort, and I don't think
Mm-hmm.
discomfort is a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, safety is guaranteed. That should be everybody. But discomfort, there might be a bit like, this is new, and your body registers that, right? Increased heart rate, something in the stomach, like, or legs want to run, whatever the feeling is. But
Mm-hmm.
to sit with it, even for a heartbeat, just to see what's on the other side of that, because there might be some really interesting insights for folks. So it's an invitation. It's not a requirement, but it's just there's something there. And I think we'll, as we piece it together, hopefully, come up with something way more creative, way more innovative that will really help so many of us.
I'm going to link the Rethinking Safety in Washrooms resource.
Yes.
And we also have a program, an on-demand washroom program. Could you tell us about that before we go?
Yes. So, a lot of these cultural issues, as I was saying, organizations are wrestling with, especially municipalities that provide recreational spaces. So this is a great place, self-paced course to be able to go through all of that, short little videos where I talk about all these issues, go into a little bit more detail onto each, and then give best practices for how to address them. There's, all kinds of additional resources, checklists and frequently asked questions, and all kinds of content that you can essentially take and run and tailor to your organization. Now that we have the on demand, we also have the live version of it where we can do a strategy session. But if you're just wanting to kind of absorb it in your own time, and maybe there's a budget consideration, the on demand is the way to go. It's really good, and has all the good stuff that we do live at your fingertips.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Guy.
Yeah, thank you.
See you later.